We already looked at what the Germans thought about the Japanese in the late 1930s. Now in this video we'll look what the Japanese thought about the Germans from pre-war to the end of World War II. So let's get started. First, we take a short look at the 19th century. For quite some time the Japanese actually oriented themselves after the French, for instance using their translated infantry manuals. Yet since the French suffered a serious defeat by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, the Japanese reoriented themselves. In 1884 a delegation of 4 senior officers was sent to a tour and investigate European armies for 1 year. They decided that the Prussian military system should be the new standard for the Japanese and requested a senior instructor from the Prussian war minister. Soon the Japanese had adapted the military system. By 1889 the Prussian draft 1884 field service regulations had been translated into Japanese. And 2 years later the army completed the transition from the French to the Prussian training regiment and immersed recruits in training and drilling according to the new infantry manual. Similarly, the Japanese held the Germans in high regard in many ways. But the reverence for the German master instructor, which in Japan often led to overestimation of things German, remained one-sided and was not reciprocated by the German side towards the teachable pupil. Although during the First World War the German and Japanese empires were enemies, there was no major change in their long-term views. Also, the German prisoners of war in Japan were treated very well. Before we move to the interwar years, it is important to note that the Japanese had a strong inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. Both had sometimes quite different views on the Germans, and these views were often adjusted to serve the agenda of the particular service. As such, in some cases, they had quite correct assessments, yet in other cases they just went fully overboard. Additionally, it is important to consider that the Imperial Japanese Army saw the Soviet Union as their main enemy, whereas the Imperial Japanese Navy was focused on the United Kingdom and the United States. This is also sometimes expressed with the Northern versus the Southern strategy. Now let's look at the interwar years. Although the Japanese had very favorable views of the Germans were less positive about the Japanese. Additionally, German Far East policy in general favored the Chinese due to their resources instead of the Japanese. The fact that in German Far East policy China always ranked ahead of Japan for economic reasons and that the Japanese in Berlin was regarded only from the point of view of power politics was a painful experience for the Japanese and led to an underlying mistrust of Berlin's politics. By the way, this is also related to the fact that the Germans supplied the Chinese with panzers, something I covered in an older video, where I still have hair. Note that the Sino-Japanese cooperation only ended in 1938. Nevertheless, the Japanese were quite forthcoming to the Germans. For instance, in 1934, a German official of the Air Ministry was granted access to the Japanese carrier Hrsg. His report was also read by Hitler himself. The Germans returned the favor by giving the Japanese access to one of their Panzerschiffe, literally armored ship, but usually called pocket battleships in English. After that, the Japanese invited the German specialists for an in-depth study of Japanese carrier design, and this was not a small favor. The Imperial Japanese Navy's development aid to the Germans in the field of aircraft carriers was unprecedented, insofar that no other foreign power had ever been granted anything comparable. Yet the Germans this time did not return the favor, quite to the dismay of the Japanese. Still, the Japanese treated the German naval attaché better than any other foreign attaché. Yet what was likely far more important was the Anglo-German Naval Treaty of 1935, in which the Germans limited the navy to 35% of the tonnage of the Royal Navy. The Japanese bitterly remarked that they regarded the agreement almost as an alliance. Still, the Japanese kept positive relations with the German Navy, and there was an intelligence cooperation going on from 1935 onward, which was extended in 1937 and 1939 about various powers like the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain and the United States. But let's move to the crucial year of 1939. As mentioned before, the Imperial Japanese Army favored the Northern strategy. And in late summer 1939 this resulted in a clash between the Red Army and the Japanese Army, which is also known as the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol or Nomonhan for the Japanese. Why is this so crucial? Well, in the midst of Zhukov's offensive, with the 23rd Division literally fighting for its life, Japan's reputed ally Nazi Germany concluded a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This dramatic turnabout caused the fall of the cabinet in Tokyo and consternation throughout the army. Soon afterwards, the Germans invaded Poland, and the Japanese likely at this point had lost their trust with the Germans and focused on their own agenda in Asia. Yet it could also be that they were just cautious. In November 1939, the Germans were informed that the Japanese were not willing to openly compromise their neutrality by allowing the German Navy to use their ports, but were willing to cooperate along the lines that they had been agreed upon in 1938. After the Battle of France, the Japanese were quite certain that Great Britain would be defeated rather soon as well. Although previously the Japanese were reluctant to join a full alliance with Germany and Italy due to fears of the United States intervening, this had changed after the successful campaigns. In the mistaken assessment that the German invasion of the British Isles was on the verge of a successful conclusion, Tokyo leadership had finally responded to the German bid for alliance in 1940. Nevertheless, the Japanese, especially the Navy, made sure that the Tripartite Pact was not a military alliance and allowed for a lot of leeway. But let's move forward to 1941. In April 1941, the Japanese signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, which was probably not the best timing since in June 1941 the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union. As we all know, the Japanese did not intervene in this conflict for different reasons, something I will cover in the future. Additionally, they became less optimistic about the German capabilities. The fact that the German advance in the Smolensk area had been delayed for more than a month in any case caused the Japanese to have initial doubts about the success of the German campaign plan and seemed to confirm the decision of the Imperial Conference. Over the course of the war, the Imperial Japanese army became more and more cautious about the German ability to defeat the Soviet Union. For the first time, the army's strategic plans expressed doubt that Germany could defeat the USSR in 1942, but they held out hope that the German occupation of the Caucasus might cause Stalin's regime to collapse. Now, one might argue that the Japanese had quite a correct assessment about the German chances. Yet remember, they also assumed that the Germans would defeat the British in 1940, and there's a pattern here to these assumptions. For the Japanese, the Western Allies became the main opponent after 1939. As such, they quite often overestimated or emphasized German victories against the Western Allies. While the Japanese took a very realistic view of Germany's warfare against the Soviet Union, the Japanese lost to their own wishful thinking when assessing the German chances against England and North America. This is also reflected by the fact that the Japanese initiated peace talks throughout the whole Soviet-German war. Meanwhile, from November 1941 to February 1945, Tokyo pushed for a separate peace between the Germans and the Soviets so that the Axis could concentrate on the Western Allies. A major shift came after the German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943. The Japanese also sent a delegate to Germany since they were not so happy about their own ambassador Oshima there, which they referred to as the Ribbentrop's messenger boy. But even on the scene, the Japanese military did not gain a positive picture of Germany's fighting power. This, according to a cable dated 5th July 1943, was lower than the previously assumed in Japan. Moreover, the Wehrmacht lacks men. Falling industrial production, gasoline and oil shortages also had a negative impact on Germany's effectiveness. The collapse of the last German offensive in the east, Unternehmen Zitadelle, Operation Citadel, strengthened the Japanese in their revised assessment of German endurance. This led to a further negative shift around fall 1943. At this point, Japanese newspapers started to print Soviet army reports and news from a Swiss newspaper. Additionally, the Japanese now interpreted nearly everything as a German weakness to confirm their own strategy. Basically, at this point, there was a limited to no mutual exchange of military information between Japan and Germany. Probably the final nail in the coffin was the failed coup attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944. The military coup against Hitler, as it had to be present itself from the Japanese point of view, completely destroyed the remaining trust in the German army. At this point, the Japanese just waited for the Germans to collapse and used the German defeat as a negative motivation for its own population. To summarize, although the Japanese held the Germans in very high esteem, the continuous disregard by the Germans before the Second World War led the Japanese to be quite distrustful of the Germans. The various treaties by the Germans with principal enemies of the Japanese, namely the Anglo-German German Naval Treaty of 1935 and the Soviet-German Pact of 1939 were received very negatively, and the latter even brought down a government. During the war, the Japanese evaluation of Germany and its forces was mostly skewed to the lens of self-interest, or better, lenses of self-interest, since both the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy at points got their estimates correct, although usually only when it served their own agendas. This also reflects the rather abusive relationship of information within the Japanese military forces. Furthermore, it underlines the fact that the Axis was not really an alliance, but a bunch of fellow have-nots nations, as historian Drea referred to them. Or as Guth and Norman put it, the Axis lacked common statements of purpose, common great strategic conceptions and planning, and even in some cases common enemies. Rather, it was a collection of predators, none of which trusted one another. Well, I hope you liked this episode. Thank you here to Michael for sending me in service of the Emperor, Peter and Anna for sending me Japan's Imperial Army, and of course big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Special thanks to Justin for helping me finding resources. As always, source a link in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.